In police museums all over Europe, there are items of evidence that have brought some of the world's worst criminals to justice. Behind every object in these crime museums is a fascinating and sometimes macabre story. In any murder inquiry, one of the most important facts to establish is the time of death, and certain changes that occur in the body after death are used to estimate this. Body temperature, rigor mortis, and putrefaction. But in some cases, where these signs are difficult to interpret, there's another method that can be extremely useful: the study of maggots. Although disliked by most, maggots are appreciated by fishermen and makers of horror films, as well as forensic pathologists. Because as a number of high-profile murder cases have shown, maggots can provide evidence that means the difference between a verdict of guilty or innocent. A case from the 1960s, sometimes called the Lydney murder, shows how the study of maggots found on the corpse was crucial in establishing time of death, as well as the victim's identity. In 1964, two boys set out to look for bait for a fishing expedition.
One Sunday morning, Tony and I went off into the woods looking for somewhere to collect maggots. We uncovered a leg, which we thought was a tailor's dummy, a mannequin. And I was holding a tin of maggots and slowly came to the realisation that maggots wouldn't be eating a tailor's dummy. And in great horror, I dropped the maggots, and we then raced into Bracknell Police Station. And the young lady behind the desk was very shocked as I shouted at her, "We found a real live dead body." From that moment on, we were whisked away in a police car.
Yeah, when I arrived at the scene, which is a wooded area, there was a large mound of earth and bracken. You could just make out some of the limbs of the lower part, and there was a very small part of the lower jaw exposed. Although it was obviously apparent that this person was dead, it was moving, and it was quite spooky, to say the least. And the reason for the movement was that it was absolutely alive with maggots. Initially, the police that were in attendance assumed that the body had laid there for something in the region of 3 to 6 months.
The renowned pathologist, Professor Keith Simpson, was called to the scene. Simpson saw that it was too late to measure body temperature, as the victim had been dead for too long, and rigor mortis had long since passed off. Instead, Simpson turned his attention to the thousands of maggots that had colonised the corpse. He suspected that he was looking at the maggots of the common bluebottle, Calliphora erythrocephalus, but as routine, he collected some for identification.
To estimate the time of death of a body, relying on the hatching of flies' eggs, really depends on what information you have available, particularly the meteorological findings in the area and the type of vegetation which covered the body or on which the body was lying at that time.
Simpson told the police that the body had been there for at least 9 or 10 days, but probably no more than 12. The police were amazed that such a short length of time was put forward, but Simpson had made a special study of maggots and was confident of his findings.
Flies will not infest a body until the body temperature has dropped to about 30 degrees. After that time, they arrive, and in fact, one fly may be responsible for laying about 300 eggs. With regard to the development of maggots themselves, they divide it into 3 stages. The first stage, the first instar as it's called, lasts about 8 to 10 hours. And then after that, the second stage, 2 to 3 days, and the final stage, which is the fully mature maggot, will take 5 to 6 days. So adding it all up, it could be anything from 8 to 10, 11 days before the actual pupa formation occurs.
The maggots on the body in Bracknell Woods were third-stage maggots. As Simpson wrote, they were mature, indeed elderly, fat and indolent, but he could see that they were not in pupa cases. So Simpson told the police that the eggs had been laid 9 or 10 days earlier. Taking into account the time needed for the flies to find the body, this put the time of death at the 16th or 17th of June. From the Missing Persons Bureau at Scotland Yard, one name stood out. A Peter Thomas had gone missing from his home at Lydney, Gloucestershire, on the 16th of June. Though Lydney was more than 100 miles away from Bracknell, where the body had been found, police investigating his disappearance had an instinct that this might be their man.
Because the body was so decomposed, wisely, Simpson decided to examine it as much as possible at the scene. And he noticed that there was a pool of blood on the left side of the voice box. Underneath that, he found that the bones of the voice box, or larynx, were fractured and shattered, and he came to the conclusion that this was the result not of a strangulation, but of a blow across the voice box in that area, causing their fracture.
Curiously, Simpson had also noted beech leaves over the burial area. No beech trees grew in the whole of Bracknell Wood, suggesting that they could have been brought to the scene by the murderer. Before long, he saw that in all areas, the body resembled the missing man, Peter Thomas. Fingerprints expertly taken from the badly decomposed, peeling fingers matched exactly with those of Thomas. Peter Thomas had lived the life of a hermit in a wooden bungalow just outside the Welsh border town of Lydney. Although he inherited over £5,000 from his father, he looked like a down-and-out. When police searched his home, they found several letters referring to a loan for £2,000 he had made to a certain William Brittle, a heating engineer from Rotherwick in Hampshire. It transpired that Brittle had advertised a quick return for an investment in an agricultural scheme, and Thomas, against the judgment of his bank manager and his solicitor, had agreed to loan the money. The loan had been due for repayment in June, the month Peter Thomas had disappeared. When police tracked down Brittle for questioning, he admitted that he had gone to meet Thomas in June for the purpose of repaying the money. The date he said he visited him was the 16th of June, the day that Keith Simpson had put as the time of murder. Brittle's previous career in the army was also of interest to the police. They discovered that he had been on an unarmed combat course, which included learning a blow known as the chop, something that relied more on expert training than brute force. Exactly the kind of blow that had killed Peter Thomas. There was no evidence that Brittle had repaid Thomas, and when questioned about the money, Brittle told the police that the agricultural scheme had failed, but that he had got together the £2,000 by betting on the horses. When Brittle's car was examined, nothing incriminating was found in it. No traces of blood or hair or any other matter. Only a single leaf from a beech tree showed any connection with Peter Thomas's body. But the case wasn't going smoothly. After 4 months of investigation, the police received a perplexing call. A former acquaintance of Peter Thomas stated that he'd seen him at Gloucester bus station studying the timetable on the 20th of June. He alleged that Thomas had greeted him by name. But Professor Keith Simpson was adamant that his study of the maggot infestation was the best indicator of his time of death. If Thomas had still been alive on the 20th of June, then he would have been dead for only 8 days when Simpson examined the body, and the maggot instars would have been at an earlier stage of development. The case against Brittle was that he had killed Thomas with a blow to the neck and then driven his body to the woods near Bracknell, where he had dumped it. The motive was that he hadn't the funds to repay the money he owed Thomas. Brittle insisted that he had managed to raise the £2,000 in a year by gambling, but no bookmakers could be found to support this. By the time the case came to court, 2 more people had come forward to say that they thought they'd seen Peter Thomas on the 20th and the 21st of June. The prosecution countered these witnesses with Keith Simpson's scientific evidence.
I was asked by the defence to look into the medical and pathological findings that Professor Simpson had made. And having done so, I could not in any way criticise or challenge his medical findings.
So it really became a case of Simpson's evidence against the whole of the defence case. But for the prosecution, the maggot evidence was the trump card. Referring to the people who believed they'd seen Peter Thomas, the prosecutor stated, "Does the evidence of those 3 people convince you more than the reasonable evidence of Dr. Keith Simpson, which stated that Thomas couldn't have been alive on the 20th of June? Nobody was suggesting that those witnesses were lying, but human beings make mistakes." After a trial that lasted 8 days, the jury took just 3.5 hours to find William Brittle guilty of the murder of Peter Thomas. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. As Keith Simpson later wrote, this case was a particularly satisfying one for him, where his methods of establishing time of death were put to the test, but not found wanting. And the Lydney murder, as it was known, also took on another name, the riddle of the maggots. Every complex case presents forensic scientists with its own particular challenge, and our next case shows how, against all the odds, accurate calculation of time of death and identification of remains long after the murder pointed to the killer. Today, the Hop Toon fishery near the town of Winchborough, just west of Edinburgh in Scotland, is a tranquil place where local people enjoy an afternoon's fishing. But the former quarry is still known locally as Paddy Higgins Hole, a name that refers to a tragic crime that occurred here nearly 100 years ago.
Well, when I was younger, this quarry was used by us to swim in and to come down and play in, but we were warned off it because of the Paddy Higgins, the murder. If you did come down here, you could end up like the Paddy Higgins children.
Sunday the 8th of June 1913 was a pleasant, mild day. Two ploughmen were taking a tour of some farmland and the local disused quarry. The quarry is situated about a mile to the east of Winchborough, which in 1913 was remote from the public highway and set in a heavy fringe of trees. Standing by the water's edge, the ploughman saw what looked at first sight to be a bundle floating on the surface of the water. As one of them wrote shortly afterwards, it looked like a couple of small white balls lying close together in a patch of weeds and glistening in the sun. We got hold of the branch of a tree that was lying on the bank and we put it into the water to drag those two queer white balls to the side. But as we touched them, the branch dropped from my hand. They were the knees of a child. We touched the body with a branch, and then we could see there was another body. The bodies were bound together with a cord. Police removed the two waterlogged bodies, and they were transported to the mortuary in a nearby town called Linlithgow. A police doctor there was unsure whether a post-mortem would be possible, so decomposed were the bodies. Called to the case from Edinburgh University was the eminent professor, Harvey Littlejohn. With him came Sidney Smith. This was the first major case for Smith, at the start of what would become a legendary career in forensic science. What confronted the two men hardly looked human. The small bodies had obviously been immersed in water for quite some time. When they cut away their rags of clothing, they could see that as well as their heads, their bodies, bar only their booted feet, had been converted into a substance called adipocere.
Adipocere is an unusual change that occurs in bodies that have been left in water for quite a long period of time. It's something that takes certainly weeks, but maybe months or even years to develop. It's a change that occurs when the fat in the body reacts with the water, and it produces a waxy soap-like substance that's often said to have the texture of suet.
Using this as a guide, Sidney Smith estimated that the bodies had been in the water for at least 18 months, possibly 2 years. With great skill, two men set about the post-mortem and the identification of the remains. The bodies were both male, and from examination of the teeth, they established their ages to be about 6 to 7 and 3 to 4 years old.
They found when they looked at the body that the adipocere had preserved the stomach and the intestines, and they were able to see that the contents of the stomach contained vegetables that you'd expect to find in a Scotch broth: potatoes, leeks, barley, things of that sort. Given the extent of the adipocere, and making the assumption that the vegetables were fresh, Sidney Smith made the calculation that death had occurred in the summer or autumn of 1911.
This suggested that the boys were local, and when police revisited the site where the bodies had been found, this theory seemed even more plausible. The only practical way they could have got there was on foot. The police believed that they'd been led there by their murderer, perhaps a close friend or a relative. The little boys' clothes also gave an important clue to their identity, of poor quality. One garment bore the faded mark of a poorhouse in Fife, and led the police to a list of names. Two young boys, 7-year-old William Higgins and his 4-year-old brother John, had been admitted to the poorhouse in Fife in 1910 following the death of their mother. Their father, Patrick, known as Paddy, was jailed for 2 months for failure to contribute to their upkeep. On his release, he took them both from the poorhouse. The police learnt that the Higgins boys hadn't been seen since November 1911. But it didn't take them long to locate the father. He was arrested in a nearby town where he was staying in a lodging house.
I think Patrick Higgins was a man quite typical of his time, really. He was poor, he was a working man, probably very poorly educated. He'd spent some time in the army as a young man and then came out and really took to drink, went to the bad, as you would say. He sometimes lived in the brickworks. He presumably was saving money on accommodation, because with steam power there were always plenty of warm nooks and crannies around for men sleeping rough. And he also cooked his food there. Apparently he would fry eggs on the shovel that he used at work and make soup in the pail that he used.
Higgins earned a low wage, but enough to cover the 8 shillings a week that was needed to pay for the boys' upkeep. But drink took all his funds. After his arrest, Higgins was taken to the mortuary in Linlithgow and shown the 2 bodies. When asked if he recognised them, Higgins said, "Yes, these are my boys."
In the local history library here, we have some records of the Uphall Parish Council, and there is in fact a mention of John and William Higgins, the deserted children of Patrick Higgins, and the Inspector of Poor was instructed to prosecute the father for desertion. There's another entry here that says Patrick Higgins had removed the children from the poorhouse on the 26th of August, and this I think shows Higgins trying to get the authorities off his back, and the children had in consequence ceased to be chargeable, and this I think shows us that the poor law authorities washed their hands. Their responsibility for the children ceased. Higgins had various different tales to account for the disappearance of his boys. To one person he said that they had gone to Canada. Another story that he came up with was that he had been with the boys on a train going into Edinburgh, and 2 ladies had taken a fancy to them and had offered him 25 shillings for them, which was about a week's wages at the time, and he'd handed them over.
But under police questioning, Higgins made a chilling confession. "I made the boys put their arms around each other's shoulders, and I tied them together with a piece of cord and slipped them over the bank into the water. I thought they would have been rotten by now." When asked why I'd drowned them, he answered, "I had no place for myself or them."
Paddy Higgins and his 2 children will have walked about 2 miles through a path which runs along the side of the fields, and it would have come out just to the right of where I'm standing. At that time it would have been overgrown, and they would have had quite a long, tiring, wet and cold journey to get down here.
A fellow worker came forward with a dreadful recollection. Plodding along a quiet road near the scene of the crime on a wild November night in 1911, the worker said he had passed and recognised through the gloom the figures of Higgins and his children going in the opposite direction. 2 hours later, he was surprised to see Higgins enter a public house, alone, and asked him where the boys were, to which he replied he'd got a good home for them now, and that he had come back for a drink. Higgins' trial was held at the High Court of Judiciary in Edinburgh 3 months after his arrest. Higgins pleaded not guilty, putting forward a special defence that at the time of the crime he was insane and not responsible for his actions. Against the very strong forensic evidence and the statements from the witnesses, Higgins' defence seemed non-existent. After much consideration, mainly concerned with Higgins' insanity plea, the jury returned a verdict of guilty with a recommendation for mercy. But for Higgins, there would be no reprieve, and the sentence was death.
Normally, when a man was sentenced to death, a public petition would be got up amongst those who sympathised with him to petition the authorities for a reprieve. But in Higgins' case, no public petition was got up at all, and there seems to be very little evidence of public sympathy for him. Higgins sent a letter just before his execution to the prison governor in which he claimed that his sentence was just, he had no complaints about being hanged, and it was drink, and through drink, neglect of religion had brought him to this case.
And how could Patrick Higgins have known that the inky pool so convenient for drowning 2 defenceless children would in fact preserve their bodies and thus the evidence of their time of death? And how could William Brittle have known that the decomposition of a body could so accurately pinpoint its time of death, destroying what could have been a perfect alibi?